In the year 1944, the world stood at a crossroads unlike any other moment in recorded history. Across Europe, freedom had been dismantled piece by piece, not through debate or consent, but through violence, fear, and systematic oppression. Nations that had existed for generations were conquered in a matter of weeks. Governments collapsed. Borders disappeared. Entire populations found themselves living under occupation, ruled by an ideology that rejected individual liberty and enforced obedience through terror. Cities that once represented culture and independence now lived in silence. Public squares became places of intimidation rather than gathering. Speaking freely was dangerous. Listening to foreign radio broadcasts could mean arrest or worse. Families learned to whisper. Parents taught children what not to say. Resistance existed, but it came at an unbearable cost. Executions were public. Punishments were collective. Fear was the tool of control. Nazi Germany had built more than an army. It had built a system. A war machine driven by discipline, propaganda, and industrial-scale destruction. By 1944, much of the European continent was under its grip. From the Atlantic coast to deep inside Eastern Europe, freedom had been replaced by occupation. Democracy had been erased almost overnight. For a time, the world watched. Some hoped the storm would pass. Others believed the conflict could be contained. But history does not pause for hope alone. It moves forward, demanding action. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the United States faced a hard and unavoidable truth. This war was not distant. It was not someone else's problem. It was a direct threat to the future of free societies everywhere. The attack on Pearl Harbor had ended any illusion of safety or isolation. In a single morning, Americans understood that the oceans no longer protected them. The world's war had arrived at their door. What followed was one of the greatest mobilizations in human history. The United States did not merely prepare for war. It transformed itself. Factories that once produced automobiles began producing tanks and aircraft. Shipyards worked day and night, launching vessels faster than the enemy could destroy them. Railroads carried men, weapons, and supplies across the country without pause. Fields produced food not just for Americans, but for entire armies overseas. Millions of young men left their homes and answered the call to serve. They came from farms in the Midwest, industrial towns in the Northeast, small communities in the South, and growing cities in the West. Many had grown up during the Great Depression. They understood hardship. They understood sacrifice. And they understood that some moments in history demand more than comfort or safety. These men were not driven by conquest. They were not driven by hatred. They were driven by responsibility. A belief that freedom is fragile, and that once lost, it is rarely regained without cost. They understood that if tyranny was not confronted abroad, it would eventually threaten everything they valued at home. For Allied leaders, the strategic reality was clear and unforgiving. Nazi Germany could not be defeated from a distance. Bombing alone would not end the war. The continent of Europe had to be reclaimed, step by step, beginning with a return to France. But France was no longer open ground. Adolf Hitler had ordered the construction of a massive defensive system along the European coastline. Concrete bunkers, artillery positions, machine gun nests, minefields, steel obstacles, and barbed wire stretched mile after mile. This defensive network became known as the Atlantic Wall. It was designed to make any invasion not just difficult, but impossible. Every beach was covered. Every approach was measured. Every potential landing zone was prepared for slaughter. German commanders believed that any force attempting to cross the English Channel would be destroyed before it could establish a foothold. Breaking through that wall would require an operation on a scale never before attempted. It would require precise coordination between air forces, naval forces, and ground troops. It would require secrecy, deception, and flawless timing. But above all, it would require men willing to step directly into enemy fire, knowing that many would not survive. That operation was given a simple, almost cold name: Operation Overlord. Its success or failure would not be decided in command rooms or planning maps. It would be decided by ordinary American soldiers, standing in the surf, under fire, carrying the weight of the free world on their shoulders. If you believe stories like this matter, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These stories endure only if they are remembered. The American soldiers who would one day storm the beaches of Normandy did not see themselves as heroes or legends. They were ordinary men shaped by ordinary lives. Many had grown up during the Great Depression, learning early what it meant to go without, to work hard, and to rely on one another. Scarcity had taught them discipline. Hardship had taught them resilience. And when the call to serve arrived, most did not hesitate. They came from every corner of the United States. From small farming towns where dawn meant work and sunset meant rest. From industrial cities where factories roared and shifts never seemed to end. From the South, the Midwest, the Northeast, and the expanding West. They spoke with different accents, carried different traditions, and held different beliefs. But once they put on the uniform, those differences faded. What mattered was the man beside you. Training camps across America operated without pause. Drill instructors pushed recruits beyond what they believed possible. Days blurred into nights. Muscles ached. Blisters bled. Orders were repeated until they became instinct. This was not cruelty. It was preparation. The men who trained them knew that the battlefield would be unforgiving, and that discipline could mean the difference between life and death. Recruits learned to move as units rather than individuals. They learned to advance under fire, to dig in, to take cover, and to keep moving when fear threatened to take control. They learned that hesitation could be fatal, and that trust in one another was essential. Even so, every veteran knew the truth. No training, no matter how intense, could fully prepare a man for combat. By early 1944, hundreds of thousands of American troops were stationed in Great Britain. Quiet villages, open fields, and narrow roads were transformed into massive staging areas for invasion. Soldiers trained in secrecy. They rehearsed landings on beaches that looked nothing like the real thing. They studied maps again and again, memorizing every detail they could. Many did not even know where they were going until the very last moment. In the quiet hours, thoughts returned home. Men spoke softly about mothers who worried constantly, about fathers who tried to hide their fear behind pride, about wives and sweethearts who promised to wait. Letters were written carefully, often rewritten several times. Some men wrote 2 letters. One meant to be read if they survived. One meant to be read if they did not. These were not letters of despair. They were letters of love, duty, and acceptance. As the days passed, tension grew. Rumors spread through the camps. Whispers turned into certainty. Everyone knew the invasion was coming. The only question was when. On June 5, 1944, the waiting ended. The order was given. The invasion was on. The first Americans to face the enemy would not arrive by sea. They would fall from the sky. Late that night, paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions boarded their aircraft. Each man carried heavy equipment, weapons, and supplies that weighed down both body and mind. They understood that once they jumped, there would be no turning back. They would land in darkness, often under fire, scattered across enemy territory. Their mission was vital. They were tasked with securing bridges, blocking roads, disrupting communications, and preventing German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. They knew that their success would save lives. They also knew that many of them would be isolated, surrounded, and forced to fight alone. Despite the danger, morale remained steady. These men had volunteered for airborne service knowing the risks. They trusted their training. They trusted the men around them. And they trusted that what they were doing mattered. At the same time, the greatest naval armada in history assembled in the English Channel. Thousands of ships formed long lines stretching beyond the horizon. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports, and landing craft moved slowly toward France. It was a sight never before seen, and one that would never be forgotten. On board the landing craft, American soldiers sat packed tightly together. The smell of fuel mixed with salt water and sickness. Waves slammed against steel hulls. Many men were violently seasick. Others stared silently ahead, gripping their weapons, lost in thought. There were no speeches. No music. Only the steady sound of engines carrying them toward an uncertain fate. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, visited troops shortly before the invasion. He spoke plainly. He did not promise easy victory. He did not glorify what lay ahead. He thanked them for their courage and wished them luck. In private, Eisenhower prepared himself for the possibility of failure. He wrote a short note accepting full responsibility if the operation failed. Victory or defeat, he would bear the blame alone. That was the weight of command. That was the cost of leadership. Before we continue, take a moment to leave a comment if someone in your family served during World War II. These stories belong to them, and remembering them keeps their sacrifice alive. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, history moved forward whether the world was ready or not. In darkness broken only by engine noise and distant flashes of anti-aircraft fire, the invasion of Europe began. This day would later be remembered by a simple name. D-Day. But for the men involved, it was not a symbol. It was survival. High above occupied France, American paratroopers prepared to jump. Aircraft flew low, buffeted by flak and poor weather. Tracer rounds cut through the night sky. Inside the planes, men stood packed together, hands gripping static lines, hearts pounding. Many had never jumped in combat before. Some would not survive the landing. When the green light flashed, they went out the door one by one, disappearing into darkness. Some landed in fields. Others came down in trees. Many landed far from their intended drop zones. Equipment was lost. Units were scattered. Confusion was everywhere. But the mission did not stop. Small groups formed almost immediately. Men who had never met began working together without hesitation. They relied on training, instinct, and determination. Bridges were seized. Roads were blocked. German patrols were ambushed. Communications were disrupted. Even scattered and outnumbered, the airborne troops achieved their purpose. They spread confusion behind enemy lines and slowed German response to the beaches. As paratroopers fought inland, the largest naval invasion force ever assembled moved closer to the French coast. The sea was rough. The sky was heavy. Landing craft rose and fell violently with the waves. Inside, American soldiers struggled to keep their balance. Many were sick. Others sat silently, staring at the steel ramps in front of them, knowing that when those ramps dropped, life would change forever. For hours, battleships and cruisers pounded the coastline. The sound was deafening. The horizon glowed with explosions. For a brief moment, there was hope that the bombardment had destroyed the German defenses. That hope would soon be shattered. As dawn broke, the invasion fleet reached the beaches. American forces were assigned to two primary landing zones: Utah Beach and Omaha Beach. Utah would prove difficult, but manageable. Omaha would become something else entirely. At Omaha Beach, nearly everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Strong currents pushed landing craft off course. Many units landed far from their intended sectors. Tanks meant to provide immediate support sank in deep water before reaching shore. The preliminary bombardment had missed many of its targets. German bunkers and machine gun nests remained intact, overlooking the beach from elevated positions. As the first landing craft approached, German defenders waited. When the ramps dropped, machine guns opened fire. Men were cut down instantly. Some were hit before they could take a single step. Others were struck in the water and drowned under the weight of their equipment. The surf filled with bodies, gear, and debris. The beach offered no cover. Only open sand and relentless fire. Officers were among the first to fall. Radios were destroyed. Carefully planned formations dissolved in seconds. Units were shattered. Orders could not be given. The invasion teetered on the edge of collapse. Fear was everywhere. But so was resolve. Instead of retreating, the survivors pressed themselves into the sand. They crawled forward inch by inch. They used shell craters, steel obstacles, and fallen bodies for cover. Men who had never led anyone before suddenly found themselves taking charge, pointing forward, urging others to move. Rank ceased to matter. Courage did. Small groups formed without orders. Soldiers from different units fought side by side. They advanced not because they believed they would survive, but because stopping meant certain death. Forward was the only direction that offered even the smallest chance. German fire continued to rake the beach. Mortars exploded. Snipers picked off exposed men. Yet slowly, almost impossibly, progress was made. Some soldiers reached the base of the bluffs. Others found gaps in the defenses. Engineers cleared paths through obstacles under fire. Men climbed steep slopes using ropes, roots, and bare hands, bullets striking the ground around them. Every yard was paid for in blood. Omaha Beach became a place where fear was confronted directly. Where training met reality. Where ordinary men were forced to decide, again and again, whether to move forward or give in to terror. They chose to move forward. If you're finding value in this story so far, take a moment to like this video. It helps ensure that these real moments of history continue to be told. On Omaha Beach, the invasion did not succeed because of strategy alone. It succeeded because individual men made impossible choices under unimaginable pressure. With no clear command structure, no reliable communication, and no certainty of survival, American soldiers acted on instinct, duty, and a deep sense of responsibility to the men beside them. Medics moved forward without weapons, marked only by red crosses that offered no real protection. They crawled through gunfire, reaching wounded soldiers who screamed for help or lay silent in the surf. Many medics were killed while treating others. Some continued working after being wounded themselves. They did not stop. They could not stop. Infantrymen who had lost their officers took command without hesitation. A corporal might suddenly be leading a dozen men. A private might become the point man. Orders were simple. Move forward. Find cover. Take out the enemy positions above. German bunkers dominated the battlefield. From reinforced concrete emplacements, machine guns fired down the length of the beach, cutting through advancing troops. Mortars exploded among the landing craft. Artillery shells struck the sand with brutal precision. To reach those positions, Americans had to cross open ground with no cover. And still they went. Small assault teams formed organically. A few men with grenades. A rifleman for cover. An engineer if one could be found. Together, they inched their way up narrow draws and ravines that cut through the bluffs. Every step forward drew fire. Every pause risked death. In several sectors, German positions were taken not by overwhelming force, but by bold movement. Soldiers rushed bunkers between bursts of machine gun fire, pressed explosives against firing slits, and charged entrances filled with smoke and debris. The fighting was close. Brutally close. These were not faceless heroes. They were farmers from Iowa. Factory workers from Detroit. Students from small towns who had never been more than a few miles from home. They fought not for glory, but because the men next to them were counting on them. One story repeated again and again that day was of men returning to the water, not to retreat, but to bring others forward. Soldiers guided disoriented troops off the beach. They pointed the way to cover. They shouted encouragement over the roar of gunfire and explosions. Leadership emerged not from rank, but from action. By mid-morning, cracks began to form in the German defenses. Individual bunkers fell silent. Enemy troops withdrew from exposed positions. American soldiers reached the top of the bluffs in scattered groups, exhausted, wounded, but unbroken. Once on higher ground, the balance began to shift. From above, Americans attacked German positions from the rear. Machine gun nests that had slaughtered men on the beach were suddenly vulnerable. The defenders, trained to repel a frontal assault, found themselves under fire from unexpected angles. The beachhead was no longer in danger of collapse. But the cost had been staggering. Thousands of Americans lay dead or wounded on Omaha Beach. The sand was stained dark. Equipment was scattered everywhere. The sea itself seemed to carry the weight of what had happened. Yet the line held. Against all odds, against every calculation that said it could not be done, American forces had gained a foothold in Europe. Not because everything went according to plan, but because when plans failed, men refused to quit. This was not victory yet. This was survival. And survival on that beach meant the invasion would continue. If this story matters to you, take a second to subscribe to the channel. These sacrifices deserve to be remembered, and your support helps keep real history alive. By the afternoon of June 6, 1944, the question was no longer whether the invasion would survive the morning. The question now was whether it could grow. The beaches had been taken at an unimaginable cost, but a foothold in Europe had been secured. What happened next would determine whether that sacrifice meant something lasting. Across Normandy, American forces began pushing inland. Progress was slow and uneven. Roads were narrow. Fields were enclosed by thick hedgerows that favored the defender. German resistance, though shaken, was far from broken. At Utah Beach, the landing had gone better than expected. Units quickly reorganized and advanced toward their objectives. Airborne troops who had jumped in the night finally began linking up with infantry coming from the coast. Bridges were secured. Supply routes were opened. What had begun in chaos slowly turned into momentum. Inland villages became battlegrounds. Every stone house could conceal a machine gun. Every crossroads could hide an ambush. American soldiers moved cautiously, clearing buildings room by room, often under fire from unseen positions. The fighting was close and personal. There were no sweeping maneuvers. Only steady pressure. Despite exhaustion and heavy casualties, morale remained high. The men knew something fundamental had changed. For the first time since the fall of France, Allied soldiers were fighting on the soil of occupied Europe in force. The German army, long seen as unstoppable, was being pushed back. And the Americans were not alone. To the east and west, British and Canadian forces were also advancing from their beaches. Though each nation had its own sector, the invasion was a single effort, bound together by shared purpose. When units made contact along their flanks, there was relief and confidence. The line was forming. Above them, Allied aircraft dominated the skies. German reinforcements struggled to move during daylight. Roads were bombed. Rail lines were destroyed. Supply columns were attacked relentlessly. The enemy could fight, but it could not maneuver freely. For the German command, the realization came slowly and then all at once. This was not a raid. This was not a diversion. This was the beginning of the end. Still, the fighting was far from over. German counterattacks struck at isolated American positions. Tanks rolled forward through narrow lanes. Artillery pounded newly established positions. In many places, American units held the line by inches, digging in wherever they could, often without proper supplies or rest. Leadership again proved decisive. Officers who survived the landings worked tirelessly to reorganize shattered units. Communications were re-established. Supply dumps were formed on the beaches, even under intermittent shelling. Engineers repaired roads and cleared mines. Medical stations treated the wounded around the clock. The invasion was becoming sustainable. Perhaps most importantly, the psychological barrier had been broken. For years, occupied Europe had waited for this moment. French civilians emerged cautiously from their homes, offering water, directions, and quiet gratitude. They understood what these men represented. Hope, at last, had arrived with rifles and muddy boots. For American soldiers, that realization carried enormous weight. They were no longer just surviving. They were liberating. By nightfall on June 6, the beachhead stretched several miles inland in places. It was not deep. It was not secure. But it existed. And it was growing. The cost of holding it would continue to be paid in blood. Yet the momentum now favored the Allies. Every hour that passed made the invasion stronger and the German position weaker. D-Day was not won in a single moment. It was won minute, by men who refused to surrender ground they had earned at such terrible cost. If you believe these moments should never be forgotten, take a second to leave a comment below. Your engagement helps ensure stories like this continue to reach new generations. What began on the beaches of Normandy did not remain there. D-Day was not an isolated battle. It was a turning point that reshaped the entire course of the war in Europe. Once the Allied armies were firmly ashore, the momentum that had favored Nazi Germany for years began to reverse. In the weeks that followed the landings, American forces pushed deeper into the French countryside. Progress was hard and often brutally slow. The hedgerows of Normandy formed natural fortresses, allowing German units to defend every field and every road. Tanks struggled to maneuver. Visibility was limited. Every advance came at a cost. Yet American forces adapted. New tactics were developed almost immediately. Infantry learned to move through the hedgerows with caution and coordination. Engineers modified tanks to break through dense vegetation. Artillery and air support were used with increasing precision. What had once been unfamiliar terrain slowly became ground that Americans knew how to fight on. The German army, meanwhile, faced growing pressure on all fronts. The Eastern Front continued to consume men and resources at an unsustainable rate. In the West, the Allies now had a foothold that could not be erased. Every attempt to push them back failed. As the summer progressed, American units began breaking through German lines. Towns were liberated. Supply routes expanded. The beachhead transformed into a massive logistical network, feeding men, fuel, ammunition, and food into the heart of Europe. And then came the breakout. In late July, American forces launched a decisive offensive that shattered German defenses in Normandy. Once the line broke, the war changed character. What had been slow, grinding combat became rapid movement. German units retreated in disarray. Equipment was abandoned. Entire formations were cut off and destroyed. American soldiers advanced through towns and villages greeted by cheering civilians. French flags reappeared after years in hiding. Church bells rang. People wept openly in the streets. Liberation was no longer an abstract idea. It was happening, one town at a time. But the fighting remained deadly. German forces, though retreating, were still dangerous. Rear-guard actions cost lives. Snipers and ambushes continued. Mines littered roads and fields. Victory was coming, but it was not free. What sustained American soldiers through these months was a deep sense of purpose. They understood the scale of what they were doing. They were not just defeating an enemy. They were dismantling a system built on terror and oppression. By the fall of 1944, the Western Allies had reached the borders of Germany itself. The Third Reich, once seemingly invincible, was now under assault from both east and west. The collapse was no longer a question of if, but when. None of this would have been possible without the stand made on D-Day. The courage displayed on those beaches rippled outward, shaping every battle that followed. The sacrifices of June 6 created the conditions for liberation, for victory, and for the rebuilding of a continent. History often focuses on leaders and generals. But the true engine of this transformation was the American soldier. The rifleman who pushed forward through fire. The medic who refused to abandon the wounded. The engineer who cleared mines under threat of death. Their actions changed the world. If you've stayed with this story so far, consider subscribing to the channel. These moments define not just military history, but the values that continue to shape the world today. When the guns finally fell silent and the war in Europe came to an end, the world stood changed forever. The victory was immense, but so was the cost. For the United States, the legacy of D-Day was not written only in maps and treaties. It was written in the lives of the men who stormed those beaches and in the generations that followed because they did. The soldiers of June 6, 1944, did not see themselves as heroes. Most never spoke about what they endured. They returned home quietly, built families, worked long hours, and carried memories that could never fully be shared. Yet the freedoms enjoyed by millions exist because those men stepped forward when history demanded it. D-Day became a symbol not because it was inevitable, but because it was uncertain. The invasion could have failed. Many believed it might. But ordinary Americans proved that courage, discipline, and unity could overcome even the most fortified enemy. This is why D-Day matters. It represents a nation willing to send its sons across an ocean, not for conquest, but for liberation. It represents an army made strong not only by weapons, but by values. Duty. Sacrifice. Loyalty to one another. Commitment to something larger than oneself. For the American military, the lessons of that day endure. Training matters. Leadership matters. But above all, character matters. When plans collapse and chaos takes over, it is character that determines who stands and who falls. The men of D-Day stood. They stood in freezing water under machine gun fire. They stood when their officers fell. They stood when retreat would have been easier. They stood because quitting was never an option. Today, as fewer veterans of that generation remain, the responsibility to remember falls to us. Not to glorify war, but to honor service. Not to chase conflict, but to understand the price of peace. Every cross in the cemeteries of Normandy tells a story that did not get a second chapter. Every name represents a future that was given so others could have one. These men did not grow old. They did not see the world they helped save. But they trusted that it would be worth it. And it was. The modern world, imperfect as it may be, stands on foundations laid by those sacrifices. Free nations. Democratic ideals. The belief that tyranny can be challenged and defeated when free people stand together. That belief was proven on D-Day. If this story moved you, take a moment to like this video. It helps ensure that these sacrifices are never forgotten. Leave a comment to honor the men who served, or to share why this history still matters to you. And if you believe stories like this deserve to live on, subscribe to the channel. Because remembering is not passive. It is a choice. The men of June 6 made theirs. Now it is up to us to make ours.